Okay, Lori, are you ready for me to take over?
I am.
Okay, great. If you want to go ahead and start the recording and just give me a cue.
We have done so.
Great. All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our third live learning session. This is an exciting point in the course because we're halfway through, and I always feel like you have enough adaptive leadership in your mind that it's really starting to percolate out into the business that you're doing in your everyday work. So this is a great module for anyone who works with people, is my joke I always like to tell. Really, this is a module about thinking about stakeholders and thinking about the people that you work with and what it is that brings them to the table, what keeps them working on initiatives collaboratively. And really, we're going to spend a lot of time thinking about what it is that takes people away from the work that you are doing with them that you find to be very important. I put that chat into the original chat question, just talking about sometimes you'll have a meeting with a whole bunch of people, you'll agree upon some great actions, and you walk away from the meeting, and a lot of you answered in variations of this thing that sometimes people do not follow up and do not do the things that they're doing, or sometimes they wait till the last minute, or there has to be someone reminding other people. So a lot of times people will not be able to complete the actions, and this module I think is going to help to give you an understanding of some of those forces that actually pull people away from the different adaptive challenges that you're working on. It ties back into some of the discussions that we've had about loss, and it's a great stakeholder mapping tool that we'll use that I would suggest making copies of and just kind of pull out anytime you're starting to work with a group and really think through that people in this manner. So again, I have controls now. Great. So again, you know me, nothing new in my end. Just another fun fact, I've been to every state in the United States. Like to travel a lot. So just the rules of engagement around live learning that I always like to go over are, this is really meant to be a safe space for learning, and while we are recording, we do want you to feel like you can speak freely. I really want to foster the discussion by using the chat function as much as possible, and we'll make sure that by the end of this you have an understanding of how to complete the worksheet that is due for this Friday, and then just an open discussion and questions and answers all the way throughout. So my philosophy, as you know, is just stop me whenever you have a question and we can go through it right at that point.
Did Ken show back up?
So the first thing we're going to do, if you're on the line, just mute your line, please. So the first thing I want to do is just go back through quickly a little synopsis of the first two modules that we worked on. The first module.
And he had another check for toner, so they had to go back. Yes, we had to. Yeah.
Someone on the line, please mute your line.
Yeah.
I'm just going to wait until that line is muted because I don't think anyone can hear me. Okay. I think the line is muted now. I apologize about that interruption. So let's talk a little bit about what is the work, that original adaptive versus technical module that we went through. And again, there's this handy tool that you can use to really think about the problem definition, the solution definition, and the locus of work. And with adaptive challenges, is what we're really focusing on in this course, that the problem is oftentimes unclear and doesn't appear right away, and it requires a little bit of learning and a little bit of loss. And as we've been doing our diagnostic questioning and our diagnostic interventions and interpretations, you begin to see that sometimes there requires a lot more learning around an adaptive challenge before you can even begin to take steps to resolve it. And that is, you know, the solution is also unclear and requires you to do small experimentation as you move through it to keep making progress and moving forward on your challenge. And then the work itself happens with the stakeholders, and that's what we're going to be focusing on today, is the stakeholder interactions. We want to really highlight and remember, talk about loss. We're going to talk about loss in this module. But just remember that loss has both tangible and intangible components. There's actual real losses that can happen of people's job, loss of the time that they have to work on other initiatives. But there's also the idea of the loss of comfort or the loss of identity, the loss of status quo that can really be something that people feel very deeply and can affect the way that they relate to adaptive change. And then we have that great productive zone of disequilibrium, which just reminds us that there is a limit of tolerance above which people really cannot get work done, and they get into that fight, flight, or freeze mode, and they start to practice work avoidance. And that happens also too if they're below the threshold for change, meaning that there's not enough emphasis on the adaptive challenge to really keep them moving forward. And then last module, we talked about what are my role choices, leadership versus authority. And I thought we had a great discussion about these two concepts, and I enjoyed looking through your worksheets on these. I think this is a challenging module sometimes, but I think once you begin to think of your role as having those two components and really thinking of them as both important and essential in moving through adaptive challenges, you can begin to almost budget and allocate your time better to, how much time am I going to spend on this adaptive side of things and take leadership actions, and how much am I going to have to maintain the status quo and keep things within my scope of authority. So again, it's just this idea that we have a scope of authority and authorizing environment that allows us to do our work. It's almost that exchange of goods and services where in exchange for us providing direction, order, protection, and expertise, the people that work with and for us then provide us with authority over their work. Now, leadership is really coming outside of that scope of authority, taking small steps on the edge of your authority and really beginning to take leadership actions which do the exact opposite of authority. They actually break up the status quo. They actually surface conflict. They can be somewhat risky, but you want to be careful that you disappoint people's expectations and take calculated risks that make sure that you maintain your political power and your political capital that you have within an organization. You don't want to have people mistrust you because you're moving change too fast. So let's get ourselves kind of in the frame of mind that we want to be talking about stakeholders. So thinking politically does not refer to thinking about politics. It just means the idea that, it's a political realm that you're delving into with all of the people that you work for. So that's the definition, and what we mean by thinking politically is just thinking how different actions and different things affect other people in our organizations or groups that we move within. So this is really the focus on the human dynamics that are surrounding the adaptive challenge. So the adaptive challenge has its own components, and then it has stakeholders who are working on it. And it's really that human dynamic of how people relate to adaptive change that we want to focus on for this module. We also want to think systemically rather than individually. We want to think of this as a system. Systems are often really good at keeping the status quo. I think I told you that quote a while back, that there is no such thing as a broken system because every system is perfectly set up to get the results that it is currently getting. And that system, while it might not be getting the results that you want, is definitely serving some person or some group. And that's why systems are so hard to break down, is because they're really tied to keeping the status quo going and really tied to benefiting a particular group or individual within an organization. This idea that I want you to be relentlessly optimistic, but also realistic at the same time, is just the fact that when we think about the human side of change, when we think about the people that we interact with, we always want to be positive and optimistic about their motives, their interests, their ability to participate in change, but we want to be realistic. So it is not about analyzing people and pulling apart their negative components and thinking of people in a negative fashion. You want to stay optimistic that everybody has the best of intentions at heart. And if they're not working with you, there are real concrete reasons that are taking their time, their energy, and their resources that they need to expend those somewhere else. And so we want to be realistic about what people are able to give and give a realistic picture of what is possible and not possible in working with them. And you want to take an interpretive stance. So that just means, again, going back to interpretations, there's 30 of us on this, 27 of us on this call. I think we could come up with a scenario, and we could have 25 different versions of interpretations of what might be the cause, what might be behind someone's action. And when we're in peer advising, you're really getting an opportunity to take that interpretive stance and also to engage with your fellow colleagues to see that your stance and your understanding is really just your understanding, that other people have very different ways of thinking, seeing, and believing the situation. So here is a little model that I want to introduce you to, and it looks a bit like people sitting at a table. And what it's meant to represent is that in the center is the adaptive challenge, and then these little boomerangs that come in that inner circle.
Did I call you? No. Oh, this is Amy.
Can you just put your phone on mute? Someone keeps not having their phone on mute.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to just move forward through, but if we can just make sure we're all on mute. The center circle is the adaptive challenge, and a lot of other models for stakeholder analysis really put a person or an organization, your organization, in the center of the stakeholder analysis, but we really put the adaptive challenge right there in the middle. And then those people that are in the inner loop there are representative of the people that come from different organizations and come to sit with you at the table and work on a specific adaptive challenge that you're working on together. So, that might be your organization, the United Way, a local health center, the YMCA, the local government official. It could be a whole group of people that when they go back to their organization, those dots on the outer circle show us that they really are different organizations, and that when they go back to their own organization, they have to answer to the norms, the status quo, the purpose, the mission of the organization that they're going back to. And so when I asked that question earlier about what happens when you're in a meeting and everybody agrees upon things, one of the reasons that they oftentimes cannot complete the actions is they go back to their organization being really excited about the collaborative work that you've planned together. They run it by their supervisor, their team, and their supervisor, their team, their leader says, but we need your time allocated on this. This is really important to our mission. We can't have you work on both of those. And so it's not that people don't want to participate with you oftentimes. It's that they're pulled away by other loyalties, values, and losses that are outside of the system that you don't see when they come into the room enthusiastic and energetic and ready to work. So does this make sense to everybody? Any questions about how this is organized? We're going to spend most of our time talking about loyalties, values, and losses as a way to look at individuals and organizations. So I just want to be clear that we all understand this model. Okay, I don't see any questions coming in. So I wanted to just show you a couple other stakeholder maps just to see the difference between what we're doing and what you think of as a traditional stakeholder map. You can see this one is looking at a community, and it's looking at all of the different people that come into the community. It's looking at the visitors and the locals, and that overlaid over the infrastructure and it being a destination and where those things overlay. Here's a typical one that you oftentimes see when you do an analysis of people that are working together on a project. There's the core people that are working on an initiative. Then there's the direct people who are kind of outside of that core to the functioning. They're the supporters, maybe the champions, maybe they're the decision makers that need to be consulted. And then that indirect outside is oftentimes the people that just need to be in the know that you need to be considering. So this is another way of analyzing people, analyzing how people relate to a challenge. And this is yet a third one where we have the company located in the middle, and we think about how these different things relate to the company. So it's how do the suppliers relate to the company? How do the customers relate to the company? The reason I show you these three different stakeholder analysis is because it's very important to understand that the frame that you apply to analyzing stakeholders shapes the way that you think. So if you think of your organization like this and you put yourself in the middle, then you become kind of the center of all of the work. And it's not about how people interrelate with each other, it's about how they relate to you. And then the same with this one, it's kind of separating people out and not allowing as much movement in between the groups, and not really assessing whether or not those people belong in those categories, but just having the idea that there's a core to the functioning and then people outside of that. So let's talk a little bit about selecting stakeholders. So I have some ideas here about selecting stakeholders, but I'd love to hear your ideas. So just use the chat function as I'm going through this, and I'll kind of walk through these talking points a little bit. But when you are working on a challenge, perhaps the challenge that you submitted for this course or any other past initiative that you've worked on, and you have to bring a group of people together to accomplish a set of goals and objectives and a body of work together, how do you go about doing that? How do you go about selecting your stakeholders? What's your kind of first order of business? Please just type in some responses to that as I go through this. So again, the question is, what do you do in selecting stakeholders? What's your process? So how we want to think about it in adaptive leadership is we want to think about who cares about the issue and also who's going to be indirectly affected. So the people that are directly affected by the change are usually there sitting at the table talking about the change, but sometimes we want to think about who else is indirectly affected by it and include them too. We also want to think about what perspectives are needed at the table. So if you're working within an organization, who do you need to have at the table? What components are going to help provide all of the different perspectives that you really need to make change happen? So this might be something as simple as I'm right now in the process of planning a wedding, and like, whose perspectives do I need to have? I need to have my fiance's perspectives. I need to have all of the perspectives of all the vendors that we're using. But then there's also in-laws and family members and friends, and there's a lot of different perspectives that I have to consider in planning this one event. This other idea of what are the groups and subgroups and how are they related to each other is really important. You really want to consider when you bring groups together, what's the history they have? You all function in communities, probably both as an employee, but also as a resident, right? And so there is lots of different groups and subgroups and ways that they interact in multiple variations throughout a county. So you want to think about what's the history that they have together. Is there bad blood between agencies? Is there a good chance that if one organization says no to you, that another organization will find out that they don't want to work on it, and they also withdraw their ability to work on it. And then when you're selecting your stakeholders, you want to think about who has the biggest and highest stakes, who can really benefit the most from it, and who can lose from it. And we tend to exclude those people that are going to lose when we bring stakeholders together. And adaptive leadership really encourages you to surface that loss, as we've talked about before. And when you're thinking about bringing stakeholders together, you really want to think about both who's going to benefit and who might potentially lose if the issue is resolved in the way that you want it to be resolved. And then what is the degree of power and influence? So I know when you have a meeting, there's lots of different techniques that you can use to break down power dynamics within a meeting. But they exist and they exert their influence whether or not you take steps to mediate that. Oftentimes there's the story about if you have a meeting and you have a student council member, principal, a teacher, and the school board director. You order them in the way that they're going to speak by starting with the students first and going with the superintendent last. And that's just a tool you can use to break down the power dynamic, because usually when the most powerful person in the room says something, the others are very unlikely to cross what that person said. So it's really thinking about who has power and influence and how is that going to affect what's happening in the meeting, but also who do you want to invite to the meeting that has power and influence on the particular topic area that you're working on. And then what do some of the various stakeholder groups want to see as an outcome? So when you are implementing change, you usually have a vision that you want to see. Again, it's that place, it's that future state that we want to get to. You want to make sure that you have the other stakeholder groups involved in it, and that becomes a shared vision rather than your vision being the one that you're trying to push your agenda forward. It's much more successful to really think about, here is the problem, we all have the same problem, what is the solution that is going to work for us as we move forward together. So I didn't see anybody type anything in response to that question. That's completely fine. I'm going to move into values, loyalties, and losses. So with the stakeholder analysis and adaptive leadership, you will list the person or organization, and then you will go through and you will try to figure out what that person's values are, what their loyalties are, and what their losses are. So I'm going to go through those three concepts here on the next 3 slides. So stakeholder values are really what drive and motivate behavior. And when I talk about values, I'm talking about those deep-rooted, deep-seated values that are ingrained from your cultural upbringing, from your work history, from your personal life, from your professional life. They are really your kind of core values that hold true. So a great example would be honesty. Honesty is a core value for some people. Values drive and motivate behavior. So if you can align yourself with someone else's values, if you have a common value that you can work on together, that you can kind of unite together on that common value. So in our field, public health, we're all concerned with that people can attain the highest level of health possible. Now, if we work with organizations that are not public health entities or health entities like hospitals or health centers, they don't necessarily have that same value of people attaining their highest health. But there are other values that we can unite on them. So values also inform your decision making. Every single time you come up against a decision in your life, you are drawing upon your previous knowledge, your values, what has happened to you before, and they will inform the type of decision that you're going to make. And really, if I were to ask you to list out your top 3 values, if I were to ask you to put down 10, it would really be your top 3 operating values that guide your behavior. So if you think about values and you're trying to, talk to someone about their values, it's that top 3 that come up that are usually the ones that guide the behavior. So the further down on the list they are, the less likely they are to actually affect your behavior. And in order to really look at people's values, it's important that you're not so much listening to what they say, reading their mission, reading their value statement, but you're examining their behavior. So the example that I just gave, might say that their value is honesty. And then you catch them being dishonest, so that you want to really watch a person's behavior to understand what their value might be. So an example that I always like to give, and this is kind of a silly example, but I have kids who are now able to make their own lunch, which is wonderful. But back when I used to make their lunches for them every day, peanut butter and jelly was a favorite. And if you were to ask me on any given day, like, what's one of my core values? One of my core values is environmentalism and making sure that the earth is in a state that my children can enjoy it to the same capacity that I was able to enjoy it during my lifetime. And yet every time I would have a peanut butter jar that got to the very bottom and it was sticky, I would oftentimes just throw that peanut butter jar in the trash, which is in complete opposite action to the fact that I am an environmentalist and that I believe in preserving the environment. And if you think about that behavior of me throwing away the peanut butter jar, you can think about what kind of values are actually driving and motivating that behavior. And for me, what was driving that was a sense of urgency around being on time. It's very important. I live in Washington, D.C. I have to drive my kids across town, and being on time really is a core value that that was instilled by my dad at a very early age. It was just like the utmost disrespect to be even a minute late for something. So being on time with something was a value that superseded my caring for the environment. And one of the reasons is that it's important that you understand looking at behavior instead of looking at what is said or written, is that's what you're going to be able to find commonalities in and really find out what people's true value is. And so when we're looking at other organizations, we want to see, where are they spending their time? Where are they spending their money? What other organizations are they partnering with? What types of initiatives are they involved in? That's going to tell you a lot more about what their values are than simply going on their website and reading their value their value statement or their mission statement. So can you all just throw out a couple of values that you would say are core values to you? I'd just love to hear from people a little bit about what your values are. And I'm asking you to do this not just because I want to know what your values are, but really because it gets you in the mindset of thinking about values. And as we watch other people writing in their values and really keep reading this, reading what other people write, what might come up to you, as it often does to me when I ask this question, is that people have really different values, but that there are some core things that a lot of times you can align along. So I appreciate you putting those down. It's another good idea to really examine the self before we try to examine others. So in doing this self-analysis of what our own values are, it makes us better prepared to really look at others and see what their values are. Thank you for doing that. So let's talk about loyalties. Not losses yet, we'll talk about loyalties first. So loyalties are different than values in the sense that this is about the people behind the ideas and who are you working on behalf of. Pressure to represent your constituency and make sure that you're doing what they would say is in line with the reason that they put you in the position of power that you're in. Is there a particular group or team that you are trying to ensure has resources? And do you have a bond across the organization or across into another organization that is a loyalty that will affect the decisions that you make around change? So when we think about who are we working on behalf of, how would you answer that question? Who are you working on behalf of? It's kind of a difficult question. So staff and clients, yep, the community, clients, employees and residents of the county, the mayor, administrative board of health, staff, community. These are all great answers. So who you're working on behalf of is going to be different than other organizations, but a lot of times what we want to think about with loyalties is loyalties are the characteristic that can pull people away from working on a challenge. So if you're asking people to make a change that directly affects the people that they are working on behalf of in a negative way, or their constituency, or it threatens the team that they're on, or it threatens the resources that they're trying to protect for that team, or it crosses a bond that they have with another organization, it's really important that you consider these loyalties as something that can kind of tear people away from a challenge and pull people, because they have these existing loyalties, and as you're beginning to have them work with you in the change management process, in the change process, you're going to be asking them to maybe do things that run parallel to their existing loyalties, which is fine. But if you ask them to do something that crosses a loyalty that they have to another organization, chances are they're going to pull back and go to their prior established relationship rather than to work with you on something that affects someone they're loyal to in a negative way. An example of this from a long time ago, a community that I was working with had they were working on food initiative around labeling fast food restaurants. They were trying to have that be passed as a county ordinance that all fast food restaurants would have to have, or all chain restaurants would have to have calorie counts on the menu. And they, at the same time, were trying to build partnerships with a business district. And the business district was kind of pulling away from the health department and pulling away from the health department. And they finally really dug down and got into what we want to do in adaptive challenges is to really surface the loss and surface what is happening here. And what was happening was that the business district was trying to woo 3 separate fast food chains into the county, and they were, their loyalty to bringing in business and new businesses to the county was much stronger than their partnership with the health department. So the health department had to kind of, back off and know that they were not going to align on that issue, but that there were other issues that they could align on, like a healthy workforce. So both the business district and the health department are concerned with having a healthy workforce. So you can really see how loyalties to existing work or existing people can really affect that. So who would you say that you're loyal to? What groups of people are you loyal to? And this is really, put down anything that comes to mind, just in your work, when you're evaluating, taking a next step or taking an action, who comes to mind as who you're loyal to? Community residents, partners, board staff, board of health, the community. Okay, so it's loyal to employees, supervisors, partners, and citizens. So I'm going to I'm going to put another layer on this question. So if you were asked to go to a meeting on a Thursday night and it happened to be the same night as your PTA meeting, which loyalty is going to win out? The coalition or the PTA? In my case, the PTA would win out because my loyalty to my family is stronger than my loyalty to the coalition a lot of times. For others, it might not be the same, that their work might come before their family. So for me, it's different for every individual, and you want to consider that what your loyalties are not necessarily my loyalties. So what we're trying to do is take our best guess by looking at someone's behavior and their past history of what their loyalties might be. Thanks, Phil. Depends on what's on the agenda for both, right? You want to go the one that's the most important use of your time. So let's talk about losses. I know we've talked about losses a lot before, but in this idea of stakeholder losses, again, you want to go back to the idea of resistance. Anytime you encounter resistance, it's because someone is afraid of losing something, and that might be something tangible, like a loss of resources, but it might be intangible, like a loss of respect. And anticipating what the losses people are going to have to sustain in order to move along with you is a very important part of stakeholder analysis. So it's thinking about what are the potential losses that they might have to sustain if the initiative goes in the way that you want it to. So if the challenge is resolved in the way that you want it to, what will they potentially lose by working with you on that? We've spent a lot of time talking about loss, so what I want to do is move us into this example of the worksheet, and I'm actually going to pull up. So I want to pull up really quickly the worksheet. So I'm just going to show my screen. Okay. Sorry about this, guys. I'm just trying to share my screen. Well, I'm not able to share my screen, so we'll go back and we'll take a look at the worksheet that I have on this sheet. It's not as big, but I think you all should still be able to see it.
Let me see if Antonia can fix that.
Okay. The button is just not alive for me.
I'm sorry, we're working on it.
Thank you. Oh, great. It is now. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. I'm just going to make this a little bit bigger so we can all see it. Okay, I think this is a much more comfortable view. So the first thing that you're going to do in this is, again, reframing your challenge. Basically, at the beginning of every worksheet, we ask you to reframe your challenge based on the learning that you had from the previous unit. And right here, we have a good definition of losses, loyalties, and values, and this will guide you as you do the work. What you want to do is think about the adaptive challenge that you're involved in, and I want you to list out yourself as one of the stakeholders. Yourself can be generically you, generically your team, generically your organization, whichever way you want to, whichever way is most helpful for you. So if you're talking about your adaptive challenges involving a whole coalition, you're probably going to go at like the organizational level. If you're talking about a team initiative, you're probably going to go at the individual level. So when I've seen this worksheet turned in, sometimes the stakeholders are a list of titles. People don't usually put people's names associated with them, but like this one is got some titles here associated with it. It's also got some groups of people that work together, and then it's got the community members also. So you can range your stakeholders from those that are the direct individuals that are involved to the larger groups that you're working with. But I kind of like to recommend doing a breadth of that, so doing a little bit of the individual people as well as the larger groups. So again, with this community health education specialist, what she was attempting to do is they brought on a community health education specialist to help to really think about moving to a public health, population health-based approach. And this shift is causing a lot of trouble within the organization, and their nursing staff is really not happy with the community health education specialist. The person who's directing the work is unsure of their role. The health officer is kind of hands-off. So trying to dig a little bit deeper into it and figure out, why are people acting the way that they're acting? So we'll first look at their values, and here you'll see some of the examples for the self. The values are being successful in the job, population health being a priority for her. Some of her loyalties are to the community health education specialist because she hired the community health education specialist and it has to manage them. The nursing staff, because she works closely with the nursing staff and they're kind of the heart of the health department in this case. And her loyalty is also to her family. Losses, she's afraid of losing authority, losing a sense of expertise, or being liked and respected. So really being afraid of being disliked or disrespected as a way out of this. Now, if we jump down to the community members, we'll see a much different set of values. So values, we have high quality services, high quality of health. Loyalties are families, coworkers, neighbors. Losses might be a loss of having easy access to services, or a loss of autonomy in their own health, in their own trying to attain health. What the purpose of this analysis is for you to do is that when you approach someone and you're trying to understand where they are coming from, it is a good idea before you enter into a conversation or enter into a meeting to do a stakeholder analysis and really get a sense of what could be competing loyalties that you're going to see play out in the room. What are going to be some values that you can align together on to really have one guiding purpose for the whole work, that the body of work that you're trying to do. And then the losses category is more so that you can help to surface the loss within working with people and really make sure that you're understanding that you yourself might have to lose something and that others are losing something, and that you bring those up and you talk about that. So this is the worksheet assignment. I'm seeing some questions coming in, so I'm going to answer some of the questions coming in. So, do you ever come across situations in which losses are listed more as a sense of work avoidance than actual loss that needs group attention? When I do the losses, this is an individual thing that you yourself sit down and do. So the losses are not so much work avoidance as they are actual losses that people will face. So if this is different than work avoidance. Work avoidance is more the strategies that someone puts into play when they're not interested in doing the work, whereas losses are actual losses that they might sustain or might have to, you might be able to work to mitigate together so that they're not going to face that loss. So if you know that the health officer is really, has a fear of losing competence or losing a reputation, throughout the process of working with the health officer, you can be sure to keep them well informed so that they at all times can talk about the issue that you're working on them with a high level, feeling a high level of competence, and that you conduct yourself in a way that adds to their reputation. So that's more about the losses piece. And again, if you I usually recommend this is something that you do yourself before setting out on a meeting with others, but you can do it in a small group within your organization, especially if you're doing something that involves multiple community organizations. You might want to have a small group sit down, or if you're doing something that's across silos or across teams, you might want to sit down just with your own individual team and do a values, loyalties, losses analysis for the other teams in your organization. A question popped up when I watched the video for Module 3. This is coming from Alexa. Is it possible to not meet everybody's needs? Is it possible to not meet everybody's needs? I'm not sure about the phrasing of that question. Alexa, do you mean, is it possible that you might not meet everybody's needs and that's okay? Is that the question? Yes, okay. Yes, I think that the point of this is by surfacing loss, others really understand and begin to see that everyone is losing something, not just them. And so it makes us more resilient to loss when we know we're kind of entering into loss in a group where everyone is facing a little bit of loss. And then a second question. So yes, I think that's perfectly okay that you don't have to meet everybody's needs. I think what the important thing to do is to come together and figure out what is a common uniting purpose and value and body of values that you can build a partnership upon that doesn't cross over any loyalties or doesn't ask people to go against any of the loyalties that they already have existing, and that really acknowledges and tries to mitigate loss as much as possible. So that's how I would explain this framework. And then the additional question you have, Alexa, would you recommend asking stakeholders directly about what losses they are concerned about? Absolutely. It's not the first question that you would ask. I mean, I think that once you get to know them and once you've really established a working group together, you could have a conversation about loss. I was just doing some research the other day on organizational safety, psychological safety in organizations, and there is this vulnerability loop that is talked about, and your question reminds me about that. And so the vulnerability loop is basically that the person A puts themselves out there a little bit vulnerably and says, might be facing this loss, which then gives courage to person B to also come in vulnerable and say, you know, I'm also afraid of losing these things. So conversations about loss, and that creates that vulnerability loop that then you've just created an environment where both people feel okay being vulnerable, and then actual work can begin because you have established a sense of trust, because you both become vulnerable to each other, and then you have established a sense of trust, and you can move forward on the work together, knowing that it's okay at any point to say, you know, I'm afraid of losing this, or I don't know, I've lost the sense of direction of where we're going, or you can voice uncertainty and a lot of different things. Does that answer your question, Alexa? Okay, great. So other questions. This unit is a little bit shorter than others, so we have a full 12 minutes to really discuss whatever questions you have about values, loyalties, and losses, as well as anything you have about any of the previous units, or the worksheet itself and how to complete it, or even if you want to talk about your challenge a little bit, this is a great time. So I am open to your questions. So, Alexa, I haven't ever really experienced resistance from others when I ask them to share their losses. I usually use this in the format of trying to understand what I think people's losses, fear of losses might be. And then the next unit we have is Courageous Conversations, which is an area in which you kind of check what their fear of loss is. So I think that definitely if you were to just enter into a conversation and lead right off with, you know, what are you afraid of losing and how can I help make you less afraid of that, or what can we do to kind of maybe lower that risk or lower that loss. I think people can be put off a little bit if you go too directly into talking about loss. I think it's better just talk about shared values, talk about loyalties, and then really get into loss. I think shared values is a good place to start because then you're also establishing that trust. Other questions? Do you all feel prepared to do this worksheet? I think it's one of the more fun worksheets to do. Okay. So we have 10 full minutes. I'm going to invite questions. Sarah's already done with the worksheet. Well, good. So I'm going to invite any questions to come in, and I am going to just leave silence. Okay. Lori, do you have any questions that I can clarify for you or for the group that might have come your way?
No, we haven't received any. Thank you.
Okay, great. I think this worksheet is pretty straightforward. Is there some additional resources for work avoidance? I must have misread that question. I apologize. There is not any additional resources other than some reading in the adaptive leadership work, but I believe that that's the only resources. I can take a look into it and see if I can find any other resources about work avoidance. Sarah, I'll take a check into that. Thanks, Sarah. So maybe just we'll back up a little bit and talk about the leadership versus authority. How did that unit land for people? Did it make sense? Was it useful? Was it challenging? Okay, great, Sarah. I'm glad you like that. What did you like about it? Yeah. Um, Lana, I hope I'm saying your name right. I do think that there can be a gray line sometimes, so that you're crossing over into both authority and leadership. It can be a gray area a little bit. Excellent. I like that it reinforced your ideas of what leadership are all about. Okay, I'm going to just keep it open for questions. I don't want to keep people unnecessarily, so how about, Lori, if we wait for another minute if any questions come in. If no questions come in, we can end the session a little bit early today.
Sounds great.
I really appreciate all your time on the calls. You have the highest level of participation that we've seen since the course started, and I really appreciate all your enthusiasm and participation on the worksheets and the calls, and the peer advising has been really successful, and so you all should be really proud of yourself halfway through the work, that you're really a dedicated cohort, and it's been exciting for myself and my team to work with you.
I think that's great to hear, and I think that, I'm sure that the local health departments know and understand that, contributions from the Illinois Public Health Administrators Association and the small amount of county health rankings and roadmaps funding, and then a little bit we got from the Public Health Training Collaborative, all of that cobbled together to be able to bring this training. I think they know that we have really limited workforce development opportunities, and so they've really taken that to heart and actively been engaged in participating, and it's so great to see. So we're looking forward to being able to report back to IAPHA how great their attendance was, so that that investment was really worthwhile.
Great. Yeah. As I know that affects the future of
Right.
your work. So, yeah, so thank you, everybody. I really appreciate it. It's a pleasure to get to have this interaction with Illinois.
We appreciate you and look forward to the continuation of the course.
Great. I'll talk to some of you next week in peer advising. And then please, as always, feel free to reach out to me at any time. I'm always available. Email elearning@nacho.org just in case I'm not checking my email on that day, but we'll always make sure someone can respond to you. So thank you very much, Lori. I think that's good for us for today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.